Hello, friends, and welcome back to r/ProRevenge. We'll start our video with a petty revenge, and the next one will be about the inheritance proceedings. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Did me wrong and then lied about it. So about 1997 or thereabouts, I stopped by the local Taco Bell before my third shift job. Ordered a couple chicken burritos, I love chicken, and during my order over the drive-thru intercom, they asked if I'd like a bean burrito instead. I said no, I want two with chicken. They said, okay, pull ahead to the window. Paid and went to my job about a mile away and sat in the parking lot, to eat before my shift. Ate the first one, not bad with their hot sauce, then bit into the second one. Beans. Retroactively, I saw what they'd done. Had two burritos under the lamps, one chicken, one bean, and instead of making another one just for me, they just slid the bean one in there, figuring I'd never come back. Oh, I went back. They denied that's what they'd done, but F you. Got my $1.69 refund and vowed never to go back. I haven't. And every time I pass a Taco Bell, I tell that story. Retail, but especially food axiom: treat a customer well, they tell a friend. Treat them badly, they tell everyone they know for years. And our next story. You don't get the house, you don't get the money. The story begins in the early 90s when my parents got divorced. My mother had been given custody of me and my older sister by the court. We moved into my maternal grandmother's house. The house was built by my grandfather in the 50s and had never been renovated. There were two apartments in the house, one apartment on the ground floor and one on the first floor. My grandma lived in the lower apartment, but even though it was actually too small for a woman with two teenage children in the upper apartment, my mother initially wanted us to see the house as two separate households. It took my grandma some time to convince my mother to consider the house as a whole as not my grandmother's, but ours. My mother and grandma decided not only to renovate the house, but also to refurbish it. But before that could happen, something important had to be clarified. Because my grandfather had built the house and he died without writing his last will, the house was not legally owned by my grandmother at the time, but belonged in part to my mother and her sister. Let's call her Estelle. My grandma bought Estelle's share. My mother put all the money my father gave her after the divorce into the house. Among other things, she paid off an old loan that was still on the house. In order not to repeat my grandfather's mistake, the three made a will. The share in the house that belongs to my grandmother should go to my mother after her death, as she lived in the house and contributed significantly to its value through her investment. Estelle should get a large amount of money, and everything else my grandma owns should be divided equally between the two. Fast forward to 2015. My mother had retired and took care 24/7 of her mother, who's suffering from dementia. The alternative of putting my grandma in a nursing home was out of the question for us, so I was all the more pleased that my mother got help with housework for a few hours a week. This domestic help, let's call her Nadine, is the girlfriend of Estelle's son, Tim. When Tim was a teenager, he'd fallen out with his father, and most of our family had very few contacts with him. He showed up once a year, called on our grandma's birthday and on Christmas. For over 20 years, he was, besides these three occasions, basically non-existent. Nadine works full-time in a nursing home. After having been in the hospital for a few days, my grandma was supposed to be in that very nursing home for a while. The insurance companies offer this option so that caregiving relatives should be able to recover for a few days. Themselves and my mother really needed the break. In the next few months, it was 2016 then, Tim appeared once a week to, as he said, take care of Grandma. This taking care consisted of going to Grandma, who was sitting in her TV chair, holding her hand, asking if everything was okay, and driving off 15 minutes later. Estelle's birthday was in March. My mother told me later that Estelle had advised her in a conversation that she should put some money aside for the time when Grandma is no longer there. Nadine celebrated his birthday in July. Since my grandmother was again spending a few days in short-term care at that time so my mother could recover a little, Tim offered to pick up Grandma for the party. And in August, the mood changed. Estelle expressed concern that my grandma's confusion was really dementia and instead suggested that grandma was in her condition because of poor care from my mother. Tim was increasingly aggressive towards my mother. In a conversation I insisted on participating, he accused my mother of embezzling my grandmother's money and evading taxes. After we calmed down again, I suggested that instead of just coming by for 15 minutes a week and spreading accusations, he should really take care of Grandma and look after her for a week at a time. He agreed. 2 weeks later, Tim and Tim's brother appeared with his family and picked up Grandma for a visit to a fair. When they came back, they told my mother that they'd ordered a new TV chair for Grandma and that my mother should pay for it with her money. The reason was that my mother lived rent-free in Grandma's house and practically doesn't do anything. Since my grandmother was so gracious to take in a mother and her 2 children, she was entitled to the money my mother supposedly saved on rent. A few weeks later, my mother had an appointment and asked Estelle to take care of Grandma during that time. When she came back, there was also a note on the table. Estelle had taken Grandma with her to look after her. First a week to try out. The joy that my mother had about the free time she gained quickly vanished when it turned out 2 days later that Estelle took the opportunity to go to her bank with my grandmother to revoke my mother the right to access my grandmother's account. We only found out about it by accident. A few days later, 9 people came to my mother's home, including my grandmother, Estelle, Tim, T.S., siblings, and their family. When my mother was about to let 2 visitors out of the door, one of the group stormed through the open front door, pushing my mother and sister aside and demanding that they leave the lower apartment immediately. They supposedly had no right to be there and are only allowed to stay in the upper apartment. A neighbor saw the incident and called the police. The group convinced the police that my mother actually lived in the apartment upstairs and had no right to be downstairs. To this day, I still don't understand why the policeman accepted it that way. In any case, he asked my mother to leave the lower apartment until the matter was legally clarified. The day after, my mother went to see a lawyer to give her access to the home again. After a week back and forth, my relatives agreed to let my mother back into the apartment. They cleared the furniture out of the apartment beforehand because they thought it belonged to my grandmother and switched back to the old locks. Since they were 9 again and my mother had a nervous breakdown from the whole affair anyway and was on the verge of a second, I wanted to receive the key in her place. Since my mother lives in a small town, it didn't take long to find out that Tim was named the sole heir in the new will. Nadine had said the same to a friend, and if you know someone who knows someone, small town. My grandma died in July 2017. Shortly afterwards, I drove to the court to deposit my grandma's will there so it could take effect. The lady there said there would already be another recent will. I still insisted on depositing the old one. The will was opened a few weeks later. We saw for the first time what we were dealing with. The new will was drawn up by a notary, which is normally better than a handwritten will from over 20 years ago. In the will, Tim is established as the sole heir, with Estelle in the second position in the event that Tim would have died before my grandmother. Not a word about the fact that part of my mother's house already belonged to her. Instead, she was given the right to live in the upper apartment. But the real shock came when we saw the date. The will was written in July 2016. On the day when Tim and Estelle had so generously agreed to pick up Grandma from the nursing home, when they were still trying to pretend everything was fine and their only concern was Grandma's well-being. I made an appointment with an inheritance lawyer. My time to shine. It took me almost an hour to convince the lawyer that my grandma had dementia and that the new will is therefore invalid. Doctors' reports that certified dementia back in 2011. So the matter goes to court, which means that the lawyers write letters back and forth. In one of the letters, Tim's lawyer mentions there's an assessment from a doctor that clearly confirms my grandma did not have dementia. That would contradict the evidence I submitted to my lawyer, so the court commissioned a new independent expert assessment. Although I had a lot of evidence and the behavior of my grandmother was always a clear sign of dementia for me, we waited a little nervously for the assessment. We received the assessment, and what can I say? I haven't read anything so beautiful and sad at the same time for a long time. It's sad because the expert quotes from many reports that describe what my grandma was going through after she was brought to Estelle's house. Nice because the appraiser completely dismantled the other side's argument. For every argument the other side has come up with by then, the appraiser has evidence to invalidate it. Most impressive is the fact that the alleged report by Dr. A is completely worthless to the other side. On the contrary, the doctor was so incompetent that he accidentally not only failed to refute my grandmother's dementia, he even confirmed it. So there's a court date. The appraiser, Dr. A, and the notary who wrote the will are present. A is given the opportunity to defend his report before the judge, and he only makes it worse. It's going too far to explain that now. In any case, A made it clear to the judge that he had no idea how to carry out the test. Then it's the notary's turn. When he testified, it turns out there were 2 appointments with him and my grandma. And in their attempt to look particularly good in front of the judge, Estelle and Tim admit that they were both present at both appointments. Not only that, apparently the conversation and further coordination between the notary and my grandmother went completely through Estelle's hands. The trial ends, and my mother's lawyer is overjoyed. She explains to me that if there were any doubts that the new will does not reflect the will of my grandma, these are finally resolved by the statement of the notary. A few days later, the judge gives the verdict, and it's even better than expected. The house was awarded to my mother. Tim and Estelle are no longer entitled to even 1 cent from my grandma's inheritance. Estelle can keep old furniture, clothes, some jewelry they took from my grandmother's house. That means that's all she can hope for. Greedy, scammy relatives like this are the very bottom rung of humanity. They can't be punished enough for their crimes. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.